My name is Elena, and I'm 22. The judge is reading my grandfather's will while my parents sit across from me in this courthouse. And honestly, you'd think Christmas morning just arrived early for them. Their eyes are practically glowing as they wait to hear about the $2 million they're convinced belongs to them. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt betrayed by your own family. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Let me back up. 3 months ago, I was just Elena Morrison, working at a coffee shop and living in a tiny studio apartment. Today, I'm sitting in family court watching my biological parents, and I use that term very loosely, try to steal my inheritance. The same parents who abandoned me when I was 4 years old and only crawled out of whatever rock they'd been hiding under when they heard about Grandpa's money. My mother, Jessica, keeps dabbing her eyes with a tissue like she's actually grieving. My father, Robert, has his arm around her in this performative display of unity. It's quite the show, really. Too bad I know the truth about who these people really are. Your Honor, my father says when prompted, his voice dripping with false sincerity. We're simply requesting what's rightfully ours. Elena was raised by my father, yes, but she's our daughter. This money should have come to us first, then to her when we pass away. It's only natural. Natural. That's rich coming from someone who treated me like a mistake that needed to be hidden away. Judge Martinez looks unimpressed as he flips through the thick stack of papers that make up Grandpa's will. His eyebrows keep rising higher with each page, and I'm starting to think there might be more surprises in that document than even I know about. Mrs. Morrison, the judge addresses my mother, you're claiming that you should inherit your father-in-law's estate despite... He pauses, reading something that makes him shake his head. Despite not visiting him once in the last 15 years? My mother's tissue dabbing intensifies. We wanted to visit, Your Honor. We truly did. But Elena was so attached to her grandfather, and we didn't want to confuse her or disrupt the stability he was providing. Translation: we were too busy living our new lives to be bothered with the daughter we never wanted in the first place. The judge's expression suggests he's not buying their performance any more than I am. He sets down the first section of the will and picks up what looks like a separate folder, thick with documents and photographs. I see we have some additional materials here, Judge Martinez says, his tone shifting to something I can't quite identify. Mr. Morrison, are you aware that your father documented every financial transaction he made on your behalf from 1999 to 2019? The color drains from my father's face so fast you'd think someone just told him his credit cards were maxed out. Which, knowing my father, they probably are. I'm not sure what you mean, Your Honor, he stammers, but his confident posture is crumbling by the second. Oh, this is about to get interesting. My grandfather was always meticulous about record-keeping, but I had no idea he'd been keeping track of whatever this is. The judge opens the folder and I can see it's stuffed with receipts, bank statements, and what looks like handwritten notes in Grandpa's careful script. My heart pounds as I realize this might be bigger than just my inheritance. Well, Judge Martinez says, and I swear there's the hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I think we're going to need to examine these documents very carefully before we proceed. My parents exchange a look that could freeze hell over, and for the first time since this whole mess started, I allow myself a tiny spark of hope. Let me tell you how this all began, because trust me, it's a story worth telling. Picture this. I'm 4 years old, sitting on Grandpa's front porch with my little suitcase covered in Disney princess stickers, watching my parents drive away. They told me they'd be back in a few days. That was 18 years ago. My parents, Jessica and Robert, had me when they were 17. Typical teenage pregnancy story. They got caught up in the moment, both families freaked out, and suddenly these two kids who could barely take care of themselves were responsible for another human being. Both sets of grandparents forced them to get married and move in with my paternal grandfather, the man who would become the only real parent I ever knew. Grandpa hired nannies to help take care of me while my parents finished high school and started college. The plan was that this would give them stability and support while they figured out their lives. What actually happened was that they figured out their lives would be a lot easier without me in them. I remember fragments from those early years. My mother studying at the kitchen table while Mrs. Patterson, our first nanny, fed me dinner. My father coming home late from his part-time job and going straight to his room without saying goodnight. The way they'd talk about their college plans like I wasn't sitting right there coloring in my book. We just need to get through the next few years, my mother would say to my father, not realizing I was listening from the hallway. Once we graduate and get established, we can figure out what comes next. What came next was them slowly disappearing from my life. It started with missed bedtime stories because they had study groups, then skipped Saturday morning cartoons because they had social events. By the time I turned 5, they were more like distant relatives who happened to live in the same house rather than parents. Grandpa filled every gap they left behind. He read me bedtime stories, taught me to ride a bike, helped with homework, and showed up to every school event. When other kids asked where my parents were, I'd just shrug and say they were busy. Grandpa was there, and that felt like enough. The summer before I turned 6, my parents announced they'd been accepted to universities in different states. "It's time for us to start our real lives," my father told Grandpa over dinner, as if the life they'd been living with me wasn't real at all. They promised they'd visit during breaks and call every week. For the first few months, they actually did. My mother would call every Sunday evening and ask about school, and my father would send postcards from campus. But college has a way of showing you new possibilities. And apparently those possibilities didn't include a daughter they'd never wanted in the first place. The phone calls became monthly, then sporadic, then non-existent. The postcards stopped coming. Christmas and birthday cards arrived late, if at all, with generic messages that could have been written to any child. "Don't take it personally, sweetheart," Grandpa would say when I asked why Mommy and Daddy didn't call anymore. "Some people just aren't ready to be parents, but that doesn't mean you're not loved." And I was loved. Grandpa made sure of that. He took me to father-daughter dances at school, taught me to change a tire, and explained boys to me when I got my first crush. He was the one who helped me with college applications and cried when I got my acceptance letter. Mrs. Patterson became like a grandmother to me, staying on even after I outgrew needing a nanny because she and Grandpa had become genuine friends. She taught me to cook, braided my hair for school pictures, and always made sure I felt special on holidays. Looking back now, I realize Grandpa was protecting me from something I was too young to understand. The reality that my parents had moved on with their lives and started over, as if I had never existed. They got married to other people, had other children, built the families they actually wanted, and never once looked back to see what they'd left behind. By the time I turned 10, my parents had become like characters in a story someone used to tell me, distant figures I could barely remember. My father, Robert, graduated with a business degree and married a woman named Caroline. My mother, Jessica, became a nurse and married a man named David. They each started having the children they actually wanted. I found out about my half-siblings through social media, of all places. Have you ever experienced that moment when you accidentally discover your own family has been pretending you don't exist? It's quite the gut punch, let me tell you. I was 14, doing research for a school project, when I stumbled across my mother's Facebook page. There she was, all smiles and family photos, with her husband David and their 2 beautiful children, my half-brother Jake and half-sister Lily. The family looked perfect, happy, complete. Not one single photo included me. Her bio read, "Blessed mother of 2, married to my best friend, living our dream life in Colorado. Mother of 2, not 3, 2. My father's Instagram was even worse. Professional headshots, vacation photos from beach resorts, pictures of him teaching his son Marcus to play baseball. The caption on one photo read, "Teaching the next generation of Morrison men the family traditions." Morrison men. As if I didn't exist. As if 18 years of carrying his last name meant absolutely nothing. I spent hours scrolling through years of their posts, looking for any mention of me, any sign that they remembered they had another child. Nothing. Christmas morning photos with their new families opening presents under perfect trees, birthday parties with elaborate themes and dozens of relatives, anniversary celebrations and family reunions, a complete family history that somehow erased me entirely. "Grandpa?" I asked that night over dinner, my voice carefully casual. "Do you ever hear from Mom and Dad anymore?" His fork paused halfway to his mouth. We never talked about them. It was an unspoken agreement that had developed over the years. They were gone. We were fine without them. Life moved on. "Not really, sweetheart. Why do you ask?" I told him what I'd found online. About the Facebook posts and the Instagram photos, and the way they'd apparently written me out of their life stories completely. Grandpa set down his fork and was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired in a way I'd never heard before. "Elena, I want you to understand something. What your parents did, abandoning you like that, it says absolutely nothing about your worth as a person. You are smart, kind, funny, and more capable than most adults I know. Their inability to see that is their loss, not yours." "But why didn't they ever come back, even just to visit?" Grandpa sighed. "Because acknowledging you means acknowledging their mistake. And some people would rather pretend their mistakes never happened than take responsibility for fixing them." That conversation changed something in me. I stopped wondering if they'd ever come back. I stopped saving my best school papers to show them someday. I stopped leaving space in my life for people who had already filled that space with other things. Instead, I focused on building a life with the family I actually had. Grandpa taught me to drive in his old Buick, cheering when I successfully parallel parked. Mrs. Patterson helped me pick out dresses for school dances, always making sure I felt beautiful. Our neighbor Mr. Chen taught me basic car maintenance because every young woman should know how to check her own oil. These people, Grandpa, Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Chen, my teachers, my friends' parents, who always made extra room at their dinner tables, they became my family. The kind of family that shows up, pays attention, and sticks around even when things get complicated. Meanwhile, my biological parents continued their lives in other states, posting their picture-perfect moments and never once wondering about the daughter they'd left behind. Honestly, their loss. Because they missed out on watching me grow into someone pretty amazing, even if I do say so myself. But here's the thing about abandoning someone and then pretending they don't exist. Sometimes the universe has a funny way of making sure they show up exactly when you least want them to. And that's exactly what happened when Grandpa's lawyer called me 3 months ago. College was supposed to be my fresh start, my chance to build an identity completely separate from being the girl whose parents left her. I chose a school 3 states away, not to get closer to my parents, but to get as far from their memory as possible. Grandpa was so proud when I got into the engineering program. My granddaughter, the future architect, he'd beam to anyone who would listen, even though I'd explained a dozen times that structural engineering and architecture are different fields. Details didn't matter to him. I was going to college, I was brilliant, and he was going to tell everyone about it. He insisted on paying my tuition, despite my protests. Elena, this is what the money is for. Your grandmother and I saved every penny so you could have opportunities we never had. Let me do this. So I let him. Full tuition, room and board, textbooks, even spending money for pizza and late-night coffee runs. Grandpa treated my education like the best investment he'd ever made. During my sophomore year, I started hearing from my parents again. Not directly, of course. That would have required actual courage. Instead, they began reaching out through distant relatives who barely knew me. Your cousin Rachel mentioned she ran into your mother at the grocery store. Mrs. Patterson told me during one of our weekly phone calls. Apparently, Jessica was asking about how you're doing in school. Asking about me to a cousin I'd met maybe twice in my life, rather than picking up the phone and calling me directly. Classic. The indirect inquiries continued throughout my junior year. My father's sister heard through her neighbor that I was studying engineering. My mother's brother's wife mentioned at a family reunion that I was doing well and growing up beautiful. All secondhand information gathered from people who actually cared enough to stay in touch. I started to wonder if maybe they were working up the courage to reconnect. Maybe they'd matured enough to realize what they'd given up. Maybe they wanted to be part of my life again. Then I graduated. Grandpa was there in the front row, cheering louder than parents with 6 kids when they called my name. Mrs. Patterson flew in from her retirement home in Florida. My best friend's family treated me like their own daughter, taking pictures and insisting on a celebration dinner. My biological parents? Radio silence. Not even a card. That's when I realized their renewed interest wasn't about me at all. They weren't proud of my accomplishments or curious about my life. They were gathering intelligence, keeping tabs on their investment. Because let's be honest, they'd contributed nothing to my success, but they were still legally my parents. If something happened to Grandpa, they wanted to know exactly what assets might be coming their way. The pattern became clear over the next year. Every few months, there'd be another cousin or family friend casually mentioning that Jessica or Robert had asked about me. Never anything personal or emotional. Always practical questions. Where was I living? What was I doing for work? How was my grandfather's health? Grandpa was slowing down by then. He was 78, still sharp as ever. But his arthritis was getting worse and he tired more easily. I'd moved back home after graduation to help him with the house and keep him company. We fell into a comfortable routine. Morning coffee together, him reading the newspaper aloud while I checked emails, evening walks around the neighborhood where he'd lived for 40 years. You know, Elena, he said one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, I want you to know that everything I have will be yours someday. The house, the savings, everything. Your parents made their choices a long time ago. This family is you and me. I squeezed his weathered hand. Don't talk like that, Grandpa. You're going to outlive us all. But deep down, I knew what he was really telling me. He was warning me that when the time came, there would be a fight. My parents might have abandoned me, but money has a way of bringing people back from the dead. What I didn't know was that Grandpa had been planning for that fight for over 20 years. and he was about to checkmate players who didn't even know they were in the game. Grandpa passed away on a Tuesday morning in March, quietly, in his sleep. I found him when I brought his coffee upstairs, looking peaceful and dignified even in death. The man who had been my anchor for 18 years was gone, and I felt like I was drowning. Mrs. Patterson flew in immediately, taking charge of arrangements while I sat numbly in the funeral home, picking out flowers and caskets for the only parent I'd ever really known. The service was beautiful, packed with neighbors, former students from his teaching days, and friends who'd known him for decades. My biological parents didn't come to the funeral. Not that I was surprised. Death makes people uncomfortable, especially when it involves family members they've spent 20 years pretending don't exist. A week after the funeral, Grandpa's lawyer, Mr. Davidson, called to schedule a meeting about the will. I assumed it would be straightforward. Grandpa had always been clear that everything would come to me. I was prepared for a simple transfer of assets, and maybe some sentimental bequests to close friends. What I wasn't prepared for was the phone call I received the night before the meeting. Elena? The voice was unfamiliar, but the name in my caller ID made my stomach drop. Jessica Morrison. My mother. I hadn't heard her voice in over 15 years. Hi, I managed, my voice cracking like I was 13 again. Oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry about your grandfather. I know how close you two were. Her voice was soft, sympathetic, exactly what a grieving granddaughter would want to hear, if it wasn't completely fake. Thank you, I said carefully. Listen, honey, I know this might seem sudden, but your father and I have been talking. We feel terrible about the distance that developed between us over the years. Life just got so complicated, you know. But now that you're going through this difficult time, we want to be there for you. Amazing how grief suddenly made me worth their attention. We'd like to come out for the will reading tomorrow if that's okay. To support you, of course, but also because, well, legally, we should probably be there. There it was. The real reason for the call. Mr. Davidson said the reading is just for direct beneficiaries, I said, testing the waters. Well, yes, but as your parents, we're technically your grandfather's next of kin, too. I'm sure it's just a formality, but we want to make sure everything is handled properly. For your sake, Elena, we don't want anyone taking advantage of you during such a vulnerable time. Taking advantage of me. Rich, coming from people who had abandoned me and only surfaced when money was involved. I'll check with the lawyer, I said. Wonderful. We're actually already in town. We drove in this afternoon and got a hotel room. We wanted to be here for you. They'd driven 6 hours to a town they'd avoided for 15 years, gotten a hotel room, and were ready to attend a will reading they hadn't been invited to. This was clearly a spontaneous gesture of grief and concern. The next morning, I arrived at Mr. Davidson's office to find my parents already there, sitting in the waiting room like they belonged. My mother stood up and tried to hug me, but I stepped back instinctively. Elena, you look wonderful, my father said, his voice overly hearty. You've really grown up beautifully. Thanks for noticing. Only took you 20 years. Mr. Davidson emerged from his office looking surprised. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison? I wasn't expecting you. We're Elena's parents, my father said, as if that explained everything. Surely we should be present for this. The lawyer glanced at me, then back at them. Actually, let me check the specific instructions Mr. Morrison left regarding who should be present. He disappeared back into his office, leaving me alone with the two people who had given me life and then promptly exited it. Elena, my mother said softly, I know this must be overwhelming, but we want you to know that we're here now. Whatever you need, whatever you're going through, we want to help. I looked at their faces, older now, but still recognizable. My mother's eyes were the same blue as mine. My father had the same stubborn cowlick that made my hair stick up in the morning. We shared DNA, but that was about all. Mr. Davidson returned, looking troubled. I'm afraid Mr. Morrison's instructions were very specific. The initial reading is for Elena alone. However, he paused, consulting his notes. There are provisions that may require your presence later, depending on certain circumstances. My parents exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. What kind of circumstances? My father asked. I think it's best if we start with the primary beneficiary, Mr. Davidson said diplomatically. Elena, if you're ready. As we walked into his office, leaving my parents in the waiting room, I had no idea that I was about to discover just how thoroughly my grandfather had been planning for this moment, and how spectacularly he was about to outsmart two people who thought they could abandon their daughter and still claim their prize. Mr. Davidson's office felt different with just the two of us inside. Quieter, more serious. He settled behind his mahogany desk with a thick folder that had my name written across it in Grandpa's careful handwriting. "Elena, your grandfather was very specific about how he wanted this handled," the lawyer began. "Before we get to the will itself, he wanted you to read this." He handed me an envelope with, "My dear Elena," written across the front. My hands shook as I opened it. "Elena, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're sitting in that stuffy office with old Davidson, wondering what comes next. I want you to know that every day I had with you was a gift. Watching you grow from that scared little girl into the strong, intelligent woman you are today has been the greatest joy of my life. Your parents will come for the money. I guarantee it. They have no interest in you as a person. You've already proven that by becoming successful and wonderful without their input. But money changes people, and it reveals who they really are. I've spent the last 20 years documenting every penny I spent raising you, supporting them, and enabling their abandonment of you. Every receipt, every bank statement, every check for their education, their apartments, their emergencies. I kept it all. What they don't know is that every dollar was recorded as a loan. Be strong, sweetheart. Justice is coming. All my love, Grandpa." I read the letter twice before looking up at Mr. Davidson, who was watching me with what looked like anticipation mixed with concern. "He kept everything?" I asked. "Everything." The lawyer opened the thick folder. 23 years of financial records, tuition payments, apartment deposits, car insurance, medical bills, emergency loans. Your grandfather was meticulous. "But why loans? Why not just gifts?" Mr. Davidson smiled grimly. "Because gifts have to be repaid to the estate if someone contests the will based on financial impropriety. Your grandfather was a retired teacher, but he was also incredibly smart about legal protection." My mind was reeling. All those years, while I thought my parents had just disappeared, Grandpa was still supporting them, still enabling them to build their new lives while they ignored the daughter they'd left behind. "There's more," Mr. Davidson said. "The will itself is, let's say, carefully constructed. Your grandfather left you $2 million, the house, and all personal property. Clean and simple. And my parents? Nothing directly. However, there's a clause that activates if anyone contests your inheritance." He pulled out a separate document, much thicker than the simple will. "If your biological parents attempt to claim any portion of your inheritance, the estate will immediately file for repayment of all loans advanced to them over the past 23 years, with interest calculated at market rates, plus penalties for abandonment of their parental responsibilities." I stared at the document. "How much would that be?" Mr. Davidson consulted his calculator, running numbers he'd clearly calculated many times before. Based on tuition alone, both their undergraduate and graduate degrees, we're looking at approximately $180,000. Add in living expenses, emergency loans, car payments, insurance, and other miscellaneous support. He paused for dramatic effect. Plus 23 years of compound interest at 6% annually, plus abandonment penalties. The number he showed me made my jaw drop. $2.85 million. I looked at the papers spread across his desk. Bank statements, canceled checks, receipts, tuition payment records. My grandfather had been building this case for over 2 decades, creating a legal trap so perfect that my parents would destroy themselves the moment they tried to claim what wasn't theirs. So, if they contest the will, they'll owe you almost $3 million instead of getting $2 million. Your grandfather called it his insurance policy against greed. A knock on the door interrupted us. Mr. Davidson's secretary peeked in. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but the Morrisons are getting quite agitated. They're demanding to know what's taking so long." Mr. Davidson and I exchanged looks. "Shall we invite them in?" he asked. "Or would you prefer to handle this privately?" I thought about the scared 4-year-old who had watched her parents drive away. I thought about the teenager who had discovered her family's secret life through social media. I thought about the young woman who had graduated college without her parents there to cheer. Then I thought about the letter in my hands, and Grandpa's promise that justice was coming. "Let's invite them in," I said. "I think it's time they learned about the cost of abandoning your family." Mr. Davidson smiled, and for the first time since Grandpa's death, I felt like maybe everything was going to be okay. Better than okay, actually. It was about to be perfect. My parents walked into Mr. Davidson's office like they owned the place, which was ironic considering they were about to find out they owned less than nothing. "Finally," my father said, settling into his chair with the confidence of someone who thought he was about to inherit $2 million. We were starting to worry something was wrong. Oh, something was definitely wrong, just not what they thought. Mr. Davidson arranged his papers with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. Before we begin, I want to confirm that you're here in your capacity as Elena's biological parents? Of course, my mother replied. We're family. Family. After 18 years of radio silence, the audacity was almost impressive. Very well. Mr. Davidson opened the will. The last will and testament of Harold James Morrison. I, Harold James Morrison, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my entire estate as follows. He paused, looking directly at me. To my beloved granddaughter, Elena Grace Morrison, I leave my house at 247 Maple Street, all personal property contained therein, my savings accounts, investment portfolio, and life insurance policy, totaling approximately $2 million. The silence in the room was deafening. I could actually hear my father's breathing change. And to my son Robert Morrison and his ex-wife Jessica Morrison, I leave my gratitude for providing me with the greatest gift of my life, my granddaughter Elena. That was it. No money, no property, no additional provisions, just gratitude. My mother's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on a shade of red that suggested her blood pressure had just spiked dangerously. That's it? My father asked, his voice tight. Gratitude? That's the entirety of the bequest to you, yes, Mr. Davidson confirmed. My parents looked at each other, having one of those silent conversations that longtime couples master. Even though they'd been divorced for over a decade, they could still communicate their shared outrage without words. There has to be some mistake, my mother said finally. Robert is Harold's son. Legally, he should inherit something. The will is quite clear and legally sound, Mr. Davidson replied. Mr. Morrison was fully competent when he made these decisions. My father leaned forward, his business training kicking in. We'll need to contest this. Elena was unduly influenced by her grandfather. She manipulated an elderly man into changing his will. Manipulated. That was rich coming from someone who had abandoned me before I could even spell the word. You have the right to contest any legal document, Mr. Davidson said carefully. However, I should inform you that there are consequences for frivolous challenges to this estate. What kind of consequences? My mother asked. Mr. Davidson pulled out the thick folder of financial records. Mr. Morrison was very thorough in documenting his financial relationship with both of you over the past 23 years. I watched my parents' expressions shift from confused to concerned to genuinely worried as the lawyer spread decades of bank statements, canceled checks, and receipts across his desk. These appear to be loans, my father said slowly, picking up a tuition payment receipt. Exactly, Mr. Davidson confirmed. Every penny Mr. Morrison spent supporting you after you abandoned Elena was carefully documented as a loan agreement. My mother's voice was barely a whisper. Loan agreement? With interest compounding annually at market rates, plus penalties for breach of parental responsibilities. The room fell silent except for the ticking of Mr. Davidson's antique clock and the sound of my parents' world crumbling around them. What do you think will happen next? I asked, looking directly into an imaginary camera. Drop your predictions in the comments below, because trust me, you're not going to want to miss what comes next. My father was frantically shuffling through papers, his hands shaking slightly. This is ridiculous. You can't retroactively call gifts loans. They weren't gifts. Mr. Morrison, your father was very careful about the language in every transaction. Every check memo, every bank transfer, every payment was clearly labeled as loan pending repayment when circumstances permit. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. But then I remembered 14-year-old me discovering their perfect families online while I wondered why I wasn't good enough to love. So if we contest Elena's inheritance, my mother began, the estate will immediately file for full repayment of all outstanding loans, plus accumulated interest and penalties, Mr. Davidson finished. The current total is approximately $2.85 million. The silence that followed was the sound of my parents realizing they had just walked into the most beautiful trap ever constructed. My grandfather really was a genius. Have you ever watched someone's entire worldview collapse in real time? Because that's exactly what happened when my father started doing the math on those loan documents. 2.85 million, he repeated, his voice hollow. That's impossible. Mr. Davidson was enjoying this way more than he was letting on. Your undergraduate tuition at State University, 4 years at $18,000 annually. Your MBA program, 2 years at $35,000 per year. Mrs. Morrison's nursing program, 3 years at $22,000 annually. Plus living expenses, emergency loans, car payments. With each item he listed, my parents seemed to shrink further into their chairs. But we didn't know these were loans, my mother protested. Harold never said anything about paying him back. The documentation is quite clear, the lawyer replied, sliding a thick stack of loan agreements across the desk. Your signatures are on every document. I watched my father flip through page after page of his own signature, his face growing paler with each one. These weren't rushed scribbles. They were careful, considered signatures on official loan paperwork that he'd apparently been too eager to sign to actually read. "This is entrapment," my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. "He tricked us." "Actually," I said, speaking up for the first time since they'd entered the office, "he enabled you. Every time you needed money to escape the responsibility of being parents, he gave it to you. He just made sure there would eventually be consequences." My mother turned to me with tears in her eyes, and for a split second, I almost believed they were real. "Elena, honey, you have to understand. We were so young when we had you. We didn't know how to be parents. You were young when you signed these loan documents too," I pointed out. "But somehow you managed to understand those well enough." The truth was settling in now. All those years when I'd wondered why they never came back, why they never called, why they seemed to forget I existed, they were living off my grandfather's money, building their new lives with loans they never intended to repay, supporting families they actually wanted with funds that legally belonged to me. "We can't pay back $2.85 million, my father said quietly. "We don't have that kind of money." "Then I suggest you don't contest the will," Mr. Davidson replied simply. But I could see it in their eyes. They were still calculating. 2 million versus 2.85 million. In their minds, there had to be a way to make this work in their favor. "What if we contested anyway?" my mother asked. "What's the worst that could happen?" Mr. Davidson leaned back in his chair. "Well, the estate would file for immediate repayment. When you inevitably default, we'd place liens on all your assets, your homes, cars, savings accounts. We'd garnish your wages. Your credit would be destroyed. Bankruptcy might discharge some of it, but abandonment penalties are considered non-dischargeable debt in this state." The color drained from both their faces. "Essentially," he continued, "you'd spend the rest of your lives paying Elena back for the privilege of abandoning her." I had to bite my lip to keep from smiling. Grandpa hadn't just protected my inheritance. He'd created a situation where my parents would literally pay me for every year they'd ignored me. "This is blackmail," my father said desperately. "No," I said, finally losing patience with their victimhood act. "This is justice. You abandoned your daughter, lived off your father's generosity for decades, and now you want to steal her inheritance too. Grandpa just made sure that actions have consequences." My mother looked at me with something that might have been recognition, seeing me, really seeing me, for the first time in 18 years. "We could have been different," she said softly. "If we'd known." "Known what? That someday you'd have to face what you did? You should have been different because I was your daughter, not because there might eventually be financial consequences." The meeting ended with my parents leaving empty-handed and in debt to the tune of nearly $3 million. They had 30 days to decide whether to accept the will as written or contest it and trigger the loan repayment clause. As I watched them walk to their rental car through Mr. Davidson's office window, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of being protected by someone who had truly loved me. Grandpa's final lesson was the most important one: that love isn't just about being there in the good times. Sometimes love is about building walls so strong that even after you're gone, the people who matter most remain safe. 3 weeks passed before I heard from my parents again. 3 weeks of blissful silence while they presumably consulted lawyers, accountants, and anyone else who might tell them what they wanted to hear. The answer, apparently, was that they were screwed. But did that stop them? Oh, absolutely not. I was at work managing the coffee shop that had employed me through college, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Elena Morrison? This is attorney Patricia Walsh representing Robert and Jessica Morrison in the matter of Harold Morrison's estate." They'd hired a lawyer. Of course they had. "I'm calling to inform you that my clients will be filing a formal contest to your grandfather's will on the grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity." I set down the espresso cup I'd been cleaning and walked to the back office for privacy. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," I said. "Your clients abandoned me when I was 4 years old, took money from my grandfather for 23 years, never visited him once in the last 15 years, and now they're claiming I had too much influence over him? That's a simplified version of their position." "Yes. And they understand the financial consequences of contesting the will?" There was a pause. "My clients believe the loan documentation is fraudulent and unenforceable." I almost laughed out loud. They were really going to argue that their own signatures were fake? This was going to be spectacular. "When is the hearing scheduled?" I asked. 2 weeks from Friday, 10 a.m., County Courthouse. Judge Martinez presiding," Judge Martinez. I'd researched him after getting the court notice. 30 years on the bench, known for his no-nonsense approach and particular distaste for frivolous lawsuits. My parents had just picked a fight with exactly the wrong person. The next 2 weeks crawled by. I met with Mr. Davidson several times to review our defense strategy, which basically consisted of, let them hang themselves with their own rope. The evidence was overwhelming, the documentation was ironclad, and the legal precedent was clear. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't nervous. These were still my biological parents, and despite everything, some small part of me had always hoped they might someday want a real relationship with me. Filing this lawsuit was them definitively choosing money over any possibility of family reconciliation. The morning of the hearing, I put on my best dress. Navy blue, professional, the kind of outfit that said responsible adult rather than traumatized daughter. Mr. Davidson met me on the courthouse steps, carrying a briefcase that probably contained enough evidence to sink a battleship. "Ready for this?" he asked. I looked up at the imposing stone building where my family's dysfunction was about to be aired in public. More ready than they are. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table with their attorney, both dressed formally and trying to project an image of respectability. They'd aged since our meeting in Mr. Davidson's office. My father's hair had more gray, and my mother looked tired in a way that makeup couldn't hide. For just a moment, I wondered what their lives had been like all these years. Whether they'd ever thought about me. Whether they'd ever regretted their choices. Then Attorney Walsh stood up to make her opening statement, and any sympathy I might have felt evaporated. "Your Honor, my clients are the biological parents of Elena Morrison, and the son and daughter-in-law of deceased Harold Morrison. They were systematically excluded from Harold Morrison's life through the manipulative actions of the defendant, who used her position as caregiver to isolate an elderly man from his family. Manipulative. Isolated him from his family. The rewriting of history was breathtaking. I'd spent 18 years being the only family my grandfather had. I'd been there for every doctor's appointment, every birthday, every holiday. I'd held his hand through 2 surgeries and celebrated with him when his arthritis medication finally started working. My parents had sent exactly 3 Christmas cards in 15 years, but apparently I was the one who had isolated him from his family. Judge Martinez listened to the entire opening statement without expression, occasionally making notes on his legal pad. When Attorney Walsh finished, he looked toward our table. "Mr. Davidson, Your Honor, this case is quite simply an attempt by 2 individuals who abandoned their parental responsibilities to profit from their abandonment. The evidence will show that the plaintiffs voluntarily removed themselves from both Elena's life and Harold Morrison's life over 20 years ago, maintained minimal contact despite continuous financial support, and only renewed their interest in the family when they learned of a substantial inheritance." Judge Martinez nodded and consulted his calendar. "I've blocked out the entire morning for this case. Let's proceed with the plaintiff's evidence." What followed was 2 hours of the most creative fiction I'd ever heard. According to my parents' testimony, they had been loving, devoted parents who were gradually pushed out of my life by my grandfather's jealousy and possessiveness. They painted themselves as victims of an elaborate scheme to turn their daughter against them. The problem with their story was that they had absolutely no evidence to support it. No cards or letters they'd sent that had been intercepted. No phone calls they'd made that hadn't been returned. No visits they'd attempted that had been blocked. Just 23 years of their own voluntary absence, documented in excruciating detail. When Judge Martinez asked for their evidence of the manipulation they claimed, Attorney Walsh presented a timeline that was supposed to show my grandfather's pattern of isolation. Instead, it showed exactly when my parents had stopped calling, stopped visiting, and stopped caring. "So according to your timeline," Judge Martinez said, studying the document, "your client's last visit to see Elena was when she was 6 years old?" "That's correct, Your Honor." "And their last phone call to her was when she was 11? "Yes, Your Honor." "But they maintained contact with Harold Morrison for financial purposes until she was 16? Attorney Walsh looked uncomfortable. "They occasionally needed assistance, yes." "Assistance, I see." Judge Martinez made another note. "Mr. Davidson, I believe it's time to hear your evidence." And that's when the real show began. Mr. Davidson approached the bench carrying a box that looked like it weighed 40 pounds. Inside were 23 years of evidence that my grandfather had been meticulously collecting, waiting for exactly this moment. "Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit A through Z, then continue with AA through MM. That's 51 exhibits. 51 separate pieces of evidence that my parents were about to wish had never existed. He started with the loan agreements. Every single check my grandfather had written to my parents, every bank transfer, every payment, all clearly documented as loans with their signatures acknowledging the debt. Exhibit A, loan agreement for Robert Morrison's undergraduate tuition, fall 1999 semester. Amount, $4,500. Signed by Robert Morrison on August 15, 1999. Judge Martinez examined the document, comparing the signature to my father's driver's license. This appears to be your signature, Mr. Morrison. Do you recall signing this loan agreement? My father shifted uncomfortably. I thought it was just paperwork for the tuition payment. Did you read the document before signing it? The silence stretched painfully before my father finally answered. Not carefully. I see. Continue, Mr. Davidson. The parade of evidence continued for over an hour. Tuition payments, apartment deposits, car loans, emergency funds for medical bills, moving expenses, every cent documented as a loan. My parents had signed their names to nearly $200,000 in debt over 2 decades, apparently without reading a single document. But the financial records were just the appetizer. The main course was what Mr. Davidson called Exhibit MM, a thick folder labeled Elena's Life. Inside were copies of every school report card my grandfather had kept, every art project I'd made him, every photograph from school events, dance recitals, and birthday parties. 23 years of documentation showing who had actually been raising me. Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence of Elena Morrison's actual relationship with her grandfather versus her relationship with the plaintiffs. He spread out dozens of photographs on the evidence table. Me learning to ride a bike with Grandpa cheering in the background. First day of school photos where Grandpa held the sign. Christmas mornings where it was just me, Grandpa, and Mrs. Patterson around a tree. How many of these photographs include the plaintiffs? Judge Martinez asked. None, Your Honor. Then came the school records. Emergency contact forms listing Harold Morrison as primary contact and guardian. Parent-teacher conference notes signed by Harold Morrison. Permission slips for field trips signed by Harold Morrison. Who signed Elena's high school graduation permission slip? The judge asked. Harold Morrison, Your Honor. And who attended her graduation? Harold Morrison and several family friends. The plaintiffs were not present. I watched my parents shrink further into their seats as the evidence mounted. Each document was another nail in the coffin of their fabricated narrative, but Mr. Davidson wasn't finished. Your Honor, I'd also like to present evidence regarding the plaintiff's own family situations during the period when they claimed they were being prevented from seeing Elena. He pulled out printed pages from social media accounts, carefully arranged in chronological order. These are public Facebook posts from Jessica Morrison's account, dating from 2010 to present. As you can see, she frequently refers to herself as mother of 2, posts extensive photos of family vacations and celebrations, and makes no mention of Elena despite Elena being her firstborn child. Judge Martinez studied the social media posts with growing interest. Mrs. Morrison, can you explain why your public social media presence makes no mention of Elena? My mother's voice was barely audible. It was complicated. Complicated how? We wanted to protect her privacy. By pretending she didn't exist? The courtroom fell silent except for the scratching of the court reporter's pen. Your Honor, Attorney Walsh interjected desperately, these social media posts are taken out of context. What context would make it appropriate for a mother to publicly pretend her daughter doesn't exist? Judge Martinez asked coldly. No answer. Then Mr. Davidson delivered the final blow. Your Honor, I'd like the court to see Exhibit NN, Harold Morrison's final letter to Elena, written 3 months before his death. He handed me the letter to read aloud, and I felt my grandfather's presence in that courtroom, as strongly as if he were sitting beside me. My dear Elena, I began, my voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. If your parents come for the money, know that I planned for this day from the moment they walked away from you. Every sacrifice you made, every holiday you spent without them, every milestone they missed, I documented it all. Not for revenge, but for justice. You deserve better than parents who only remember you exist when there's money involved. The silence in the courtroom was profound. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. Judge Martinez set down his pen and looked directly at my parents. I've seen many frivolous lawsuits in my 30 years on this bench, but this one is particularly egregious. You abandoned your daughter, lived off your father's generosity, ignored her for 23 years, and now you want to steal her inheritance. My father started to speak, but Judge Martinez held up his hand. I'm not finished. Mr. Davidson, please present the final calculation of the loan repayment amount. This was it. The moment my grandfather had been planning for over 2 decades. The moment my parents discovered the true cost of abandoning their daughter, Mr. Davidson opened his calculator and began the math that would change my parents' lives forever. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Your Honor, based on the loan agreement signed by the plaintiffs, we have the following amounts due to the estate. He consulted his meticulously organized spreadsheet. Undergraduate tuition for Robert Morrison, $72,000. Graduate tuition for Robert Morrison, $70,000. Undergraduate tuition for Jessica Morrison, $66,000. Living expenses, emergency loans, and miscellaneous support over 23 years, $47,000. Judge Martinez was taking notes as the numbers mounted. That's a principal amount of $255,000. However, each loan agreement specified market rate interest compounding annually, which over 23 years at an average rate of 6.2% brings us to, he paused dramatically, $634,000 in interest alone. My parents looked like they were going to be sick. Additionally, Mr. Davidson continued, Harold Morrison's will included penalty clauses for breach of parental responsibilities, documented abandonment, and emotional distress caused to Elena. Those penalties, calculated at $50,000 per year of abandonment, total an additional $115 million. So the total amount due is? Judge Martinez prompted. $2,039,047. Wait, that was different from the number we'd discussed earlier. I caught Mr. Davidson's eye, and he gave me the tiniest smile. However, Your Honor, there's one final provision. Harold Morrison's will states that if this case proceeds to court and the plaintiffs lose, they are also responsible for all legal fees, court costs, and an additional penalty equal to Elena's inheritance amount as punitive damages for emotional distress. Judge Martinez leaned forward. What does that bring the total to? $4,039,047. The sound my mother made was somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. My father just stared at the numbers like they might change if he looked hard enough. $4 million. They'd just doubled down on their bet and lost spectacularly. Judge Martinez set down his pen and looked at my parents with something that might have been pity if they deserved it. Mrs. Walsh, does your clients understand what they've just done to themselves? Attorney Walsh looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. Your Honor, perhaps we could discuss a settlement. A settlement? Judge Martinez's voice rose. Your clients just spent 3 hours lying under oath about abandoning their daughter, presented fabricated evidence of manipulation, and wasted this court's time with a frivolous lawsuit designed to steal a young woman's inheritance. What exactly would they be settling? He opened Harold Morrison's will and began reading the final provision out loud. If Robert Morrison and Jessica Morrison contest this will in any court of law, they hereby acknowledge that they abandoned their daughter Elena Morrison for financial gain, showed no interest in her welfare for 23 years, and are attempting to profit from their abandonment. In such case, they shall immediately repay all loans advanced to them. Judge Martinez paused and looked up. Here's where it gets interesting. Said repayment shall be made within 60 days of judgment, after which time Elena Morrison shall be granted full legal authority to collect said debt through any means necessary, including but not limited to asset seizure, wage garnishment, and liens on all property. My parents were no longer just pale. They looked like they were attending their own funeral. Furthermore, the judge continued reading, Harold Morrison hereby apologizes to his granddaughter Elena for enabling the behavior of people who should have loved her unconditionally, and hopes this final lesson will demonstrate that actions, even delayed, always have consequences. Judge Martinez closed the will and looked directly at my parents. I have to admit, in 30 years of family court, I've never seen a more elegant legal trap. Mr. Morrison, your father essentially gave you enough rope to hang yourselves, and you took it enthusiastically. He consulted his notes one more time. The evidence presented today shows clear abandonment of parental responsibilities, documented financial dependency on the deceased, and a pattern of ignoring Elena Morrison for over 2 decades except when money was involved. Judge Martinez picked up his gavel, and I held my breath. The will of Harold Morrison stands as written. Elena Morrison shall inherit all assets as designated. Furthermore, Robert Morrison and Jessica Morrison are hereby ordered to repay all outstanding loans as documented, plus interest, penalties, and court costs, totaling $4,039,047. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. Payment is due within 60 days. Court is adjourned. My parents sat in stunned silence as people began filing out of the courtroom. $4 million. They'd come here trying to steal my $2 million inheritance and left owing me $4 million instead. As I gathered my things, I heard Judge Martinez call out, "Ms. Morrison?" I approached the bench. "Yes, Your Honor." He leaned forward and said quietly, "Your grandfather sounds like he was a remarkable man. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Your Honor." "And Ms. Morrison? I have a feeling he would be very proud of how you handled yourself today." I walked out of that courthouse knowing that Grandpa had given me something worth more than any inheritance: the satisfaction of watching people who had hurt me face the full consequences of their choices. Justice, as it turned out, was even sweeter than money. 2 months later, I was sitting in my newly renovated kitchen, the same kitchen where Grandpa and I had shared thousands of morning coffees, when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see my father standing on the porch looking like he'd aged 10 years in 2 months. He was alone, holding what appeared to be a thick envelope. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "Elena," his voice was hoarse, tired. "We need to talk." "Actually, we don't. Your 60 days expired yesterday. My attorney will be in touch about asset seizure. Please." He held out the envelope. "Just let me explain." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let him into the living room, where he'd probably played as a child back when this house was his home too. "We don't have $4 million, he said simply. "We don't have $2 million. We don't even have $500,000. That sounds like a you problem." He opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of papers. "These are the deeds to our houses, the titles to our cars, our savings account statements, our retirement fund paperwork. It's everything we have." I looked at the documents without touching them. "Your house in Colorado is worth maybe $300,000. Jessica's place in Arizona might get $250. That's not even close to what you owe me." "I know." He sat down heavily on Grandpa's old couch. "We've already filed for bankruptcy, but the court said the abandonment penalties aren't dischargeable. We'll be paying you for the rest of our lives." "Good. Our other children know now," he continued quietly. "About you. About what we did. Marcus asked me how I could abandon my own daughter. He's 16. Elena, the same age you were when we stopped sending Christmas cards." I felt a tiny flicker of something. Not sympathy, but curiosity. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That we were selfish and cowardly and convinced ourselves that you were better off without us." He looked around the room, taking in the family photos that had never included him. "Turns out we were right about that, at least. If this is an apology, it's 23 years too late. It's not an apology. You can't apologize for something like this. It's just an explanation." He stood up and walked to the mantelpiece where Grandpa's final photo of us sat in a place of honor. "He was a better father to you than I ever was. Hell, he was a better father to me than I ever was to you. He was a good man, something you know nothing about. You're right." He turned back to face me. "I came here to give you our assets and to tell you something you deserve to know. I am proud of you. Who you became, what you accomplished, how you handled yourself in that courtroom. I have no right to be proud, but I am." I stared at this man who had contributed half my DNA and nothing else to my life. "Do you want me to say thank you? To forgive you? To suddenly decide we're family? No. I want you to know that your grandfather was right about everything. We abandoned you for our own convenience. We took his money to build lives that didn't include you, and we came back when we thought we could profit from you one more time." He set the envelope of documents on the coffee table. "The bankruptcy court said we can keep one car and basic household goods. Everything else goes to you. It'll take about 6 months to liquidate. And then what? Then we spend the next 30 years working to pay you back money we'll never actually be able to repay. Jessica's already picked up a second job. I'm looking at night shift work." The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents were finally going to experience the kind of financial struggle I'd watched Grandpa manage while supporting their comfortable lives. "Elena," he said as he walked toward the door, "I know this doesn't change anything, but I want you to know that not a day went by that I didn't think about you. I was just too much of a coward to do anything about it. If you thought about me every day for 23 years and never picked up the phone, that's actually worse than forgetting I existed." He nodded. "I know." After he left, I sat in Grandpa's chair and opened the envelope. House deeds, car titles, bank statements showing modest savings that would be mine within 6 months. The tangible remains of lives my parents had built while ignoring me. But the money wasn't what mattered anymore. What mattered was the letter I found at the bottom of the envelope, written in my father's handwriting. "Elena, your grandfather left you a letter explaining why he documented everything. This is my letter explaining why he was right to do it. We told ourselves you were better off with him. We told ourselves we were too young to be good parents. We told ourselves that someday when we were ready, we'd come back and fix everything. But the truth is, we were selfish. You were inconvenient. You reminded us of mistakes we'd made and responsibilities we didn't want. So we erased you from our lives and pretended that was somehow noble. Your grandfather spent 23 years being the parent we should have been. He loved you unconditionally, supported your dreams, and protected you even after death. We spent 23 years being the parents we chose to be, absent, selfish, and delusional. The fact that you became an amazing person despite us proves that love and character aren't genetic. They're chosen. You chose to love him. He chose to love you. We chose to walk away. Some choices can't be undone. Robert, I folded the letter and put it in the drawer with Grandpa's final message to me. 2 letters from 2 very different men, telling the same story from opposite perspectives. That evening, I called Mrs. Patterson to tell her about the settlement. She listened quietly as I described the courtroom scene and my father's visit. "How do you feel, sweetheart?" she asked when I finished. "Victorious," I said. "Sad, relieved, angry, all at once. That sounds about right for a situation like this." "Mrs. Patterson, do you think Grandpa would be proud of how this turned out?" "Oh, honey, he'd be over the moon. Not because of the money, but because you stood up for yourself, because you didn't let them rewrite history or make you feel guilty for their choices." As I hung up the phone, I realized this was never really about money. It was about something much more valuable, the knowledge that I had been worth loving all along. My grandfather had spent 23 years proving that to me every day. And now, thanks to his final lesson, I'd never doubt it again. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe. And remember, family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the people who choose to show up and stay. In the end, that's exactly what I learned. Real family doesn't abandon you when things get difficult. Real family doesn't disappear for decades and then return for money. Real family documents your entire childhood because they're proud of every moment. Real family protects you even after death. Real family teaches you that you are worth loving, not because of what you can give them, but because of who you are. And sometimes, real family gets the last laugh at people who never deserved you in the first place. Justice served. Case closed. Family redefined.